Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social, democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Sebastian Moore.
And I'm hilary.salt.
And today we will be talking about, well, a few things. Firstly, gilt yields. And if you're sitting there thinking, what on earth are gilt yields? You're not alone. I'm in the same boat as you. So Hilary, who is an expert on all this sort of stuff, is going to be explaining to us average lay people what gilt yields are.
I am.
And why it's in the news at the moment. Then I will be talking a little bit about how I believe they're called tech bros, is that right?
I think that's the term people use these days, yeah.
So how Musk and Zuckerberg are kind of getting involved in UK politics and the latest developments around that. And then we'll be joined by Craig.houston, who's our STP chair in Scotland. And he will be talking to us about some Scottish issues. And then obviously we will finish off with Culture Club. Does that sound good, Hilary?
That sounds good, yes. Sounds exciting.
Excellent. Where shall we begin?
Well, for me, gilt yields are very exciting. I know for other people maybe not, but shall we start there?
Yes.
So I was going to do quite a technical piece explaining some of the issues about the fact that gilt yields have now risen quite steeply. Now, when I last looked this morning, they were about 5.4%, which is, significantly higher than they have been for the past decade. But you started saying, Sebastian, that perhaps it would be helpful to maybe do a bit of an explainer on what gilt yields are and why they're important.
Yeah, because this is obviously linked to the Truss mini-budget debacle and all of that. And you were saying how the gilt yields are currently higher than they were at Truss's time.
Correct.
I was thinking, okay, well, why is it not such an issue now? So I'd love to, understand a little bit more about what they are and what impact they have on the rest of the economy.
So shall I start right at kind of ground zero level?
Yes.
So a gilt is effectively a debt issued by the UK government. So you offer, for example, to lend the UK government £100 and they will pay you a certain rate of return. And at the end of the period of the loan, the term of the loan, let's say 30 years, they'll give you your £100 back. So you lend them £100 today, they give you £3 every year. They actually give you £1.50 every half year, but they give you £3 a year for 30 years, and then they give you your £100 back. So you've got a yield from that investment of 3%. Now, they're called gilts because the idea is that they are as good as gold. So, there's no risk of the UK government entering into default. So that's the kind of traditional understanding of the term gilt. Whether or not that's true now is perhaps questionable. Perhaps go on to talk about that being one of the reasons why gilt yields are rising.
And what does gilt mean?
So gilt is just another, if you think about a gilt-edged watch or anything like that, it just means golden.
Okay.
Coated in gold.
I assumed it was an acronym for something.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, gilt-edged, yes.
So on the government's side of this, they're issuing these gilts as a way of borrowing money so that they can finance day-to-day spending, is it?
That's right, yes, or infrastructure spending.
And on the customer side of things, the people that are lending their money, this is a safe, low-risk investment so they can derive some sort of return on it, but it's not very risky because the government are always going to pay you back.
That's right. And indeed, the biggest holders of UK gilts in terms of UK investors will be the banks, pension funds, insurance companies, people who need to have, for legal reasons as much as anything else, a big chunk of their assets in these low-risk type investments.
Okay.
So, shall I just take a step forward in the explainer? So, remember, you lent the government £100 and you're getting your £3 a year rate of return. Let's say you decide you don't want to hold that gilt for the next 30 years. You want to sell it on the market. What you can sell it for on the market depends on what somebody will pay for it. Now, let's say in the period since you bought that investment, rates of return have gone up a lot. And rates of return that people expect in the market are now 6%. Now, without you putting your techie maths head on, let's just do this in kind of very basic terms. If you're getting 3% rate of return on an investment and you expect 6%, somebody else will only buy that investment from you for £50. They won't pay you £100, because if they pay you £50 for something that pays you £3 a year, they'll be getting a return of 6%. When I said it's not quite right mathematically, it's because that doesn't allow for the fact that you get £100 back at the end of the 30 years.
And I got lost a little bit on why you're expecting 6%.
So because, perhaps inflation's gone up. And so one of the reasons why gilt yields rise is because people expect inflation to be high. They want a bigger compensation for lending you money. So if I'm going to lend you a pound, and at the end of the year you pay me that pound back and it's only worth 97 pence, I probably want more than a pound back off you, even before interest. So the higher inflation is, the higher rates of return that people expect, because they need to be compensated for the loss in value of their money.
And because they know that they can be getting a higher rate of return from other investments.
Oh, yes, in that circumstance, if the government was issuing a new bond today, they wouldn't be issuing it at a £3 per annum return. They'd be issuing it something higher. So the market determines what you can sell a gilt for. And if we just look at it the opposite way, so if rates of return were much lower, and obviously we had that whole period of quantitative easing, which we might talk about in a minute, where rates of return were very, very low. If rates of return are, say, 1.5%, and you've got an asset that gives you £3 a year, you could probably sell that asset for £200 now, because somebody can buy it off you for £200. They get their £3 a year, and that gives them a 1.5% rate of return. So this inverse relationship between what a bond costs and the rate of return it produces is really important in understanding when we talk about all these discussions on yields. So when gilt yields are high, that means the price of a yield is low. And in the same way, when the price of a gilt is low, the yield on it is high. The more you pay for an investment that gives you a fixed income each year, the less the rate of return you're getting on that investment.
Okay. So when interest rates were low and borrowing costs were low, and the government was able to borrow at 1%, I suppose, they issued a lot of bonds at the time. There's two things going on here, so let me unpick them for you. So okay. When the government could raise money cheaply, it was issuing gilts at low yields. So that's government. Yeah.
But what was also happening at the same time was that the Bank of England was following this process of quantitative easing.
Yeah.
What quantitative easing did was to try to put money in the economy by taking investments out of the economy. So in other words, what a bank would do is what the Bank of England would do is it would say to an insurance company or a bank, you sell me that bond and I will put cash in your bank account, and that cash can find its way into the economy and support the economy during the whole, COVID collapse. So what quantitative easing was trying to do, and perhaps I shouldn't pick on COVID really, because QE started in 2008 after the financial crisis. What the Bank of England was trying to do throughout that period was to take bonds, not just gilts, so bonds are issuance of debt by people like companies or the utility companies, so, private sector organisations.
But gilts are a type of bond, right?
They are, yes, issued by governments, yeah. So what the Bank of England was doing during that period was buying bonds from the market and putting cash into the market to support the economy. So what that did was to drive up the price of bonds, because there was a willing buyer all the time, the Bank of England, and therefore to push down the yield on bonds. So we've had a whole period since 2008, really, where the return on gilts and bonds has been artificially low because the bank has been buying them. So the other things that affect the yield on bonds, we mentioned one already, is inflation. So inflation has over that period been relatively low. And so that's another reason why the market accepted relatively low rates of returns on bonds.
So why are gilt yields so high at the moment?
Things we've talked about already that affect the price of gilts, and therefore the yield on gilts, are all kind of moving in the opposite direction to the way we've been used to them moving over the past decade or so. So first of all, inflation is high. Now, I know there's a kind of idea that maybe inflation is a bit more under control, but we do know that energy prices are still rising. We know that it's possible that the cost of imports will rise if we have tariffs on trade imposed by America, for example, under the new Trump regime. We know that there's a lot of geographical unrest, which, again, could affect things like the price of fuels, particularly, of energy particularly. So there's a freestanding worry about inflation.
So why was it such a concern when gilt yields were so high after Liz Truss enacted the mini budget, and it's not such a concern now?
Yes, I'll answer that.
Okay.
Probably doing it in slightly wrong order, but that's fine.
Okay.
So what happened with Liz Truss is that gilt yields rose really, really quickly. So, what's been happening, in fact, since the Labour Party's budget, is that gilt yields have been ticking up and up and up and up and up, but in a very slow manner. What happened when Liz Truss's mini budget happened was that there was a really, really rapid change in gilt yields. So they went up really, really quickly. And that was worrying for markets. It's a bit like when you get a run on the bank. As soon as you see a big queues forming, you start to get worried yourself. So as people saw the yield on gilts rising, so in other words, the price of gilts falling all the time, there was a bit of a rush to sell because people thought, oh gosh, got to sell because everybody else is. But the other thing that was a very technical thing is that a lot of the pension funds and insurers had tried to manage their risk of gilt yields changing by taking out investments called liability-driven investments, or LDIs. Now, what LDI does is to try to match the assets that an insurer or a pension fund holds with the value of the liabilities that they are required to pay out over the long-term future. Now, because of lots of ways in which regulations work, insurers and pension funds had largely, not entirely, and certainly in my professional life I did argue against this, had moved to valuing their liabilities using a gilt rate of return, which means that if gilt yields go up, their liabilities go down. Because if you're expecting a bigger rate of return in the future, what you need to hold now to pay out £1,000 in 10 years' time goes down, because you get more in investment returns. So because their liabilities were tied to the price of gilts, that meant they invested not just in gilts themselves, but in assets which moved in line with gilts. And sometimes those assets were what we call leveraged. So you'd buy an asset that if the price of gilts went up by 1%, that would go up by 2%. And the reason you would do that, kind of try to push up the way in which your asset moved when gilt yields moved, was because that would mean that you could also hold a different asset at the same time, one whose value didn't change in line with the return on gilts. So, for example, you could hold some equities or some property or some infrastructure. So you could hold something that would give you a better rate of return than the low-risk, low-return gilts. So pension funds and insurance companies were doing all that, partly because they were forced to by their regulators, and partly because they're very risk averse, perhaps too risk averse in some ways. But what that whole push to make those insurers and pension funds behave in that way did was to create a really systemic risk in the system. Because when all those billions of pounds held by those insurers and those pension funds invested in LDI started moving really, really quickly, on an hour-by-hour basis, one of the real problems was that the back room of the insurers and the asset managers really couldn't cope. So many of those organisations had really cut costs, and everybody's working from home. There was an extent to which there just weren't enough boots on the ground to deal with what you needed to do administratively to make those LDI contracts work. So what does that mean in the real world? So when if you're invested in LDI, gilt yields go up, the value of your assets goes down. The value of your liabilities has gone down as well. So it's not a problem for you as a long-term investor. But what you need to do is you need to make margin payments to the person that you've taken out this contract with. That you've taken out this leverage contract that goes up more than the yield on gilts goes up. So that just creates a big accountancy problem. And the reason you make those margin payments is so that, if your counterparty becomes bankrupt halfway through your contract, you're not out of pocket. So it created this huge problem where people were moving massive amounts of money around trying to make these margin payments. Some of those margin payments didn't happen. So some banks then started to withdraw their support for these kind of products. And there was a real risk, I think, that would be a real market failure. And that's when the Bank of England intervened. So, and in saying any of this, I'm not defending Liz Truss, but the real problem there was not that gilt yields went up, it's that they went up so rapidly over such a short space of time that the market really just couldn't cope. And actually, in some ways, I think what happened in the Liz Truss mini-budget was actually a correction of the market. Gilt yields have been too low for too long. And the only reason they were that low was because of the massive intervention of the Bank of England in its quantitative easing process. They had then, at that point, just before the mini-budget, said that they would reverse their quantitative easing and start to do the opposite, which is quantitative tightening, which is selling those bonds back to the market. Now, that kind of brings us round to where we were before we did that little detour about Liz Truss's mini-budget, which is, why is what's happening now? So gilt yields are rising, and there's three reasons for that. One is inflation, which we've talked a little bit about. One is the fact that there is an oversupply of bonds, and part of the reason for that is because the Bank of England is selling back bonds to the market. So it had purchased, I think, something like £900 billion in the QE process, and it has now started to sell those bonds back to the market. And that means there's an oversupply of bonds, which pushes down the price of bonds, pushes up the yield on bonds. And there's also an under-demand because people are a bit worried about the UK. And we've said before that, gilts are called gilts because the UK government can't go bankrupt. I think one of the things that is clear from Rachel Reeves's budget is that it's very tight. And in fact, the rise in the returns on gilts that we've now seen, I think will now have used up all of the headroom in her budget, which means either more tax rises or more spending cuts, or she decides not to apply the fiscal rules that she had said she would abide by.
Yeah, and that's just because borrowing is now costing more.
Correct. And we've got our national debt is about the same as our GDP. It's massive.
Yeah.
So I would say those are three reasons why bond yields are rising. perhaps to finish off, why does it matter? First of all, it matters for that reason we've just said, because it actually has a real impact on government finances. Secondly, it does mean that, well, it's perhaps a bit less likely that the Bank of England will reduce interest rates, which has an impact on people's mortgages and all those kind of things. And thirdly, it does mean that people will be looking for higher rates of return from other assets, which means that, if you're a company and you want to go and borrow money on the market, you'll see your borrowing costs increase as well. So if you were just about to buy a new line of machines to make your widgets more efficiently, that will cost you more to do that now. So it has real impacts in the real world.
Okay, question for the audience. Are you still with us?
I do hope so.
Well, I was there for most of it, and then my brain starts spinning and going in all sorts of directions. So I lost track at one point especially with quantitative easing and quantitative tightening, because immediately my brain thinks, wait a second, they were just doing one of them. Why are they now doing the other one if they're opposites? But that is obviously something we can explore in another episode. And I think it would really be worth looking at the Liz Truss mini budget thing in more depth as well, because I'm fascinated by what happened there and what went wrong, and it'd be interesting to see what lessons we can learn as a party for when we have a radical agenda and we want to get into government and enact that agenda. Just one final question before we move on. Obviously, New Labour came in and made the Bank of England independent. Is that something you agree with, or do you think there should be political control of the Bank of England?
I would argue really strongly that we need to take back political control over the Bank of England. So, we talked there about that number 900 billion, the cost of QE. Now, QE has been done effectively by the Bank of England without any political decisions being taken. And QT, and the speed with which they do QT, is now happening entirely independently of government, independent of any democratic control. So I would definitely argue strongly that we should have political control over those market levers.
Shall we move on to the tech bros?
Yes, so this is something where you understand some of the language that I don't understand, I'm sure.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not your typical youngster that knows about this sort of thing. Okay, so Elon Musk, as I'm sure everybody knows, has been getting involved with American politics more recently. He was heavily involved with Donald Trump's presidential campaign, and he is now the co-head of the Department of Government Efficiency.
I think that was a Freudian slip there where you called him Donald Trump.
I know, I thought I'd said Trump. Yeah.
It's fine. We'll
Donald
go with
Trump. And what's interesting is that Musk has now sort of got involved. Musk has got involved in UK politics. And I say got involved, I mean, in the past, that would have meant something. Nowadays, it just means sending out a tweet.
Yes.
Is it still called a tweet, by the way?
Because it's X now.
Yeah.
I think it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
You see, you're on Twitter, on X. I'm not. So you should probably know a bit more about this than me.
I don't think that anybody... I can't remember anybody using another verb for to tweet.
Maybe I could
Like
coin
to
it now.
X. Yeah.
So Musk tweeted about Jess Phillips, who's a Labour MP, and he basically she's rejected the idea of a new inquiry into the grooming scandals, and he said he called her a genocide rape apologist. Did you see about this?
I did, yes.
And Keir Starmer's responded to that. Now, I think what's interesting about this is that Elon Musk generally is appealing to people on the right, as we'd say, and left and right is kind of weird terms now. They don't necessarily mean what they used to, but generally people on the right have been stronger advocates of free speech, and Elon Musk has been a huge advocate of free speech on his platform X, to lots of people's chagrin. Can we say that?
Yes.
However, this is now an issue where people on the right are quite sceptical because they don't like the idea of somebody from outside of the UK. Musk is not a British citizen, and he is getting involved and influencing things in the UK. There was two more aspects to Musk's involvement. There was talk of him donating to Reform. There was this £100 million donation, and Farage responded to it saying, well, we have not had that donation or not had any promises, but we'd be happy to take money off him and if it was done in a legal way. Then, interestingly, Elon Musk tweeted saying that he doesn't think Farage is right as leader of Reform and he thinks he should be got rid of. So there's lots of conflicting intentions here. And then we come to yesterday, where Mark Zuckerberg, who has become a lot more closely linked with Trump, despite the fact that they seemingly used to hate each other, a few years back, but he actually stayed out of the American election, didn't comment on it, and then since Trump has become elected, has met him at Mar-a-Lago and has made some comments that are quite sympathetic to Trump and to the right in America, to the right of politics. And the most recent thing then is that he's basically come out yesterday and said that Meta are scrapping these fact checkers.
And Meta control not just Facebook, but also
Instagram and Threads. So
okay,
Threads is their version of Twitter. So unlike what Elon Musk has on Twitter, Meta actually had these fact checkers, people that would check what people have written and essentially ban them if they've said something that is false. Zuckerberg has basically admitted that these could often be biased. He says something quite interesting where he said that even if they're 99% accurate, and the 1% of people that unfairly dealt with, they could be banned from a platform despite having done nothing wrong. And when you're talking about the number of people that use a platform like Facebook, which is in the billions, I think now.
Yes.
This is a huge number of people that could be getting banned. And I'm sure you'll know of people that have said that they've been banned for something that they shouldn't have been.
Yes, definitely.
And so it's very interesting because Zuckerberg, who I don't think anyone a year ago would have predicted to do this, has come out and basically said that the way that Facebook has been acting has been biased against the right. The issues that he cites are things like immigration and gender, and he says they were out of touch with mainstream discourse, which I thought was really interesting, sort of admitting to that fact. And I think a lot of people, you and I included, would say that the mainstream, what we might call the establishment media and the establishment in general, have been pushing certain narratives that are very much out of touch with what the average voter thinks. And I think this is why we've seen such a rise of populism, because parties like Reform, and I think they admit to being populist, come out and say things that you don't hear from the mainstream parties, but is generally what people think.
I think that's right, yes, yeah.
So he basically throws Europe into the same bracket as China and Latin America, talking about censorship, which I thought was interesting. He's kind of putting America out there as the bastion of free speech, and then aligning Europe with authoritarian regimes.
And you could say that's also another intervention into UK politics, couldn't you? So they're both doing it.
Yes, yeah, I suppose, yeah.
The quote you didn't come up with from Elon Musk was where he called on the king to dissolve Parliament.
I haven't even seen this.
Yes, he called on the king to dissolve Parliament and insist on a new election.
Wow.
Now, I mean, intervening in other countries' elections, I kind of thought that was something that the Russians did rather than the Americans, but it seems they're trying to do that as well. And in Germany as well, I believe. So
I'm highly in favour of these social media platforms being free speech spaces. People will be concerned about what that means and the sort of speech that is allowed on there. I would say that the answer to that, if you don't like it, is to not use the social media platforms rather than banning it, because I think that has far, far worse implications. So I like a lot of what Elon Musk has done. I think he's a very interesting person and is clearly very innovative. However, perhaps let's use this, Britain, I'm speaking to Britain now, let's use this as an area where we can find some consensus, we don't want people that are not British citizens from being able to influence British politics.
Yes, and I mean, I don't really care what Elon Musk says. He can say what he wants. But I think we've got to be a bit better at just ignoring it. So I was really surprised when Keir Starmer, because he wanted to talk about his NHS reforms, didn't he? Was it yesterday? And instead of doing that, he ended up talking about the grooming gangs and Musk's comments and launching into a defence of both himself and Jess Phillips, which, you know, when he was there in front of a lot of hardworking NHS workers trying to talk about how he's tackling some of the real problems that people face in their real world lives, that felt like a really bad judgment to go off on one about whatever Elon Musk is saying.
Yes, I agree, yeah.
So let's be more focused on what are our real problems in the real world and less worried about what billionaire Americans are saying.
Yes, and I would say to anybody that's sort of thinks this is a bit weird, get used to it, because welcome to 2025. We are in this age of a new political landscape and it's being created at the moment, so buckle up.
Anything could happen.
In Bring Me Solutions this week, we are joined by the SDP chair in Scotland, Mr. Craig.Houston. Welcome.
Hi there.
So, Craig, you've got a YouTube channel. Can you tell everyone what it's called?
Craig.Houston Talks To. I was up all night thinking about that one. It's a strange name when you consider all I do now is I talk to a camera. But the channel started just through a hobby of mine. I think I'd done years ago, about 10 years ago, with Rangers Football Club, some stuff we had to do, and we had some bad board members there, and we helped oust them. So during that process, I got to know a lot of ex-players and ex-chairmen and current board members and all that. So I had a phone book full of people who were ex-Rangers players, etc. And I thought, I'm going to start interviewing them, and that's how the channel started. I had no politics tied to it at all, and that was why the name became Craig.Houston Talks To. And I started doing it with ex-Rangers. I think I had an ex-Rangers chairman as the first guest, and the next 2 or 3 were ex-Rangers players and stuff like that. And then it evolved into what it is now, which is me talking to a camera, boring people about politics.
And when did you start talking about politics, and what was the reason for that?
It was November 2023, and the reason for the switch was Michael Matheson, who, for our English viewers, Welsh viewers, is a MSP. At the time, he was a cabinet officer, minister. He had went on holiday the year before, over New Year, Christmas, New Year. And when he came home, he submitted his expenses, and £11,000 phone bill was in his expenses. And it turned out, at the end, all the lies and the cover-up and whatever, it was him. He said it was his kids. I'm sure it was a family. They were watching football matches, streaming them on the not on the Wi-Fi, through his
data roaming.
And yeah, what? Sorry.
Data roaming. Through the data roaming. That's
exactly the term. That was the term. So yeah, and he me as a Scottish person paying tax, everything paid for it, and there was a whole thing about it. So I got up this morning, right, and I didn't have any cameras or anything because I was recording my podcast at the time from a studio a friend of mine has that I was renting. So I put my phone out, and I was just really angry, and I recorded a rant, and I thought I just need to get this off my chest, and I put it out, and I recorded it on my iPhone. I just rested my iPhone on top of the laptop, so the audio was rotten, the visuals were rotten, all this stuff was terrible, and I just moaned. And I thought, well, what do I call it? And I call it a 10-minute moan because it lasted 10 minutes, and I put it out, and loads of people watched it. I thought, well, that's a bit weird. I thought, well, is it me moaning? Is that what people were buying into there? So I made one the next day. I was moaning about cyclists, so I apologise for any cyclists out there. And then the next day I'd done one about Rishi Sunak, and none of them were anywhere near the levels of the Michael Matheson one, so I understood, well, my audience are Scottish. And the next day, Hamza Yousaf done something to upset me, and I moaned about him, and that just went mental. And he became quite a hot topic for me. And the channel. I was quite disappointed when he stood down because he had given me loads of ammunition. That's it. So I fell into this. I then started getting asked to go on to other podcasts that were political and X Spaces on Twitter. I went up and spoke outside Holyrood on the 1st of April when the day the hate crime thing came about in Scotland, a horrific thing. And because you're just talking to a camera and you see the amount of viewers and you see some comments and things, you don't really understand if you're having an impact with people. And I actually got out of the car at Holyrood and went to buy a parking ticket, and people started coming over to me. Hi Craig, love the channel, great work. I'm like, oh, right, thanks. Then there's a short walk to the front of Holyrood, and then 2 or 3 people stopped me there. And then I got to the front of Holyrood and 10 or 12 people stopped me there. And then I went up to speak, and I came down after speaking, and hundreds of people wanted to come up and talk to me. And I thought, well, this is a bit mental. And then people started suggesting that I should, look at getting involved in politics or at council level or, local government level or indeed Holyrood. And that's how it started. And so this whole thing's changed my sort of life in about 12, 13 months now. And it's most bizarre.
Was it a difficult decision for you when you decided, I'm going to do something about this, I'm going to actually put myself forward and stand and get involved in politics?
I was fortunate enough that, self-employed, so, you've not got this fear of affecting your work, etc. A lot of other people have to take on board. So I didn't have that issue. And I had a bit of campaign, as I sort of touched on earlier, the Rangers stuff, that was a 3-year campaign. So I got a bit of experience with that. At the time, I'd done a lot of media stuff. In fact, the Rangers manager, Alan McCoy, walked past me one day and said, how you doing, Craig? And I thought, how do you know my name? And he said, because you're on the TV more than me. And that was bizarre, but true. It was actually true. Every day there was something else coming out about Rangers. And again, that was an accidental thing. I never went, I'm going to do this. It was just the way it evolved. So I had all this experience, and I thought, well, do you know what? Why not? Why not? We've took on some bad people before and won. Let's do it again. For an even bigger cause, to be fair. And that sounds bizarre, something that's actually bigger than the famous Glasgow Rangers. But, the 5-6 million people could benefit this time, not just half the population that support Rangers.
Moving on from football, I think.
So, Hilary and I, whilst we're big fans of Scotland and we love it as a place, we're probably less knowledgeable about Scottish politics. Well, certainly less knowledgeable than you. So we're hoping you could give us a bit of a summary about what's going on there. And obviously it feels like, from here, living in England, it feels like Scottish politics is dominated by the independence question.
Yeah, very much so. It's been a horrible place to live as a unionist. If the Scottish Unionists didn't do what they done in 2014, and that was vote against the referendum, the question that was posed to us, then there would be no union. It's as simple as that. I think over the last 10, 12 years with the Scottish devolution question and Brexit, unionists in Northern Ireland and Scotland have been particularly badly treated, I feel. The way Northern Ireland's been treated with the whole Brexit thing's ridiculous. I've got friends over there. I was doing business as a consultancy basis. A company trying to put items in and out of Northern Ireland. It's completely farcical that I can't just send a parcel from Glasgow to Belfast when we're in the same country, and it doesn't need to go through hoops and other things that if I was sending it to you guys down south. Scottish Unionists, we've had every unionist party try to find out how to phrase pissing up their leg nice that doesn't sound quite offensive, but they have. And that's where we're at. And the mad thing is, I keep saying to folk, if we hadn't done what we've done, there would be no union. And I don't expect Scottish Unionists to be treated any better or any different from the rest of the union. But what I do quite like is an appreciation of it. And people say understand that Scotland is a bit different. You've got different dynamics. And it is now front and centre of every political discussion. And it's horrific because we've all done it. We've all lost friends, some family, colleagues, neighbours that don't talk in Scotland now. because of the devolution question. It is that crazy. And what happened, my campaign was from 2012 to 2015, and we had the referendum in the middle, so I wasn't active in it, but I was concerned about it. And it was the first time ever in my life where people demanded to know your relationship with a ballot paper. Because before that, you would go and you would vote, and your wife might ask you, or your colleague at work might ask you who you voted for. And that's how we led our life. But in the run-up to that referendum, people demanded to know how you were voting. A completely ridiculous notion, but that's how it happened. So everybody was talking about it. It was a big, serious run-up to it. And there's people, I've got family members that will not talk to me. And that was only because I voted for a union. Now that I'm actually active and try to save it politically, I'm kind of finished, right? I've got ex-colleagues, ex-friends, ex-neighbours who I've had great times with, who simply won't speak to me. And that's not because I'm this guy that's now, leading this part of a party that's a unionist party. That's got nothing to do with that. It's up before that. So that's what kind of happened up here. So you can't go anywhere now without the independence question coming up in some description. And it's ridiculous. We need at least 5 years of this of a Hollywood Parliament where we don't talk about it. And what we do is we try and fix the ills of the last 18 years of SNP power. It might not be fixable in 5 years, but we at least need a 5-year go at this, where we get some sensible people in the room. And I don't care what party they are. We need to ask them in day one, are you here for your benefit, that Rosette's benefit, or the country of Scotland's benefit? And if the answer is the third one, we've got a chance.
Craig, for those people who are perhaps not familiar with Scottish politics, can you perhaps give us a couple of examples where the nationalism question affects real everyday things? Like maybe energy or...
Everyday things like going to the shops, right?
Yeah.
Aldi or Lidl's might put out a steak, right, and they put a sticker on it. And they'll have a Union Jack because they're having a campaign for folk to buy British. And we look people up here want to have campaigns to boycott Aldi's or Lidl's or whoever it is that's doing it, because that's a Scottish thing. It's a Scottish product. You no danger to put a Union Jack on it. You're thinking, oh, stop it. And people forget that we are British. Whether you like it or not, you're British, right? And you've got a British passport and you HMRCs where your tax goes and all these things. But they're actually trying to convince you that doesn't happen, and it's a voluntary relationship. And it's just like, oh, stop it. Just stop it, please.
I know at our conference, Craig, you talked a bit about the oil refinery.
Yeah.
And
Grangemouth's finished.
Yeah.
The 70s and 80s, when we found oil, and it was like great, and it was great for the whole United Kingdom, and everybody, Aberdeen just went boom, a beautiful city that just expanded. And I worked up there for about 6-7 months, lived in the city, and very prosperous. This was back 2002, all off the back of oil. We then came up to the referendum, and we were sold this dream that oil was going to be our liquid gold. And we were all going to have, riches that we couldn't handle. And then they lost power a wee bit, and they had to get the Greens in bed to have a coalition government the last election. And it all changed. Suddenly oil was a bad thing, and we can't have that, and we can't do this. And then we were going to become reliant on wind. And I mean, we've pawned it all. The last thing that Nicola Sturgeon done almost before she lost their job was she pawned the licenses for the seabed where you could put a offshore wind turbine. Every single, and this is a mad thing, we auctioned it with a maximum price. We actually auctioned off our resource with a maximum price, right? I don't get that. And we also gave everybody a guarantee, by the way, that if you buy some and the wind doesn't blow, we'll give you some money, right? And by the way, see when the wind does blow and we get producing electricity that we buy off you for the grid, we'll give you extra than the actual price for electricity. So when the wind, and we buy it off you, we give you extra. And when we don't buy it, we give you subsidies, right? Plus we put a maximum price on what you could offer us for this. And we sold it to every single one of them to foreign businesses. And some of them were actually foreign countries national energy companies. So Spain and Norway, the countries, own some of our resources, and we don't. So even when we're trying to say, we're going to have this green transition, and you're like, you've pawned all that. So yeah, we get a bit of money off of that. But what would be the problem in saying, well, it's our seabed, so either we'll sell it to either Scottish / British companies, or we'll just keep it for ourselves, right? And we'll do that thing that we used to do. I was thinking about this the other day. Council workers, you used to have folk work for our councils that were joiners and electricians, right? It doesn't exist anymore because even our local governments pawn everything out. They sell everything, they have nothing left, and we go, oh God, we'll get this arm's length company now that we've sort of sold off, and we need to pay you more now so you can manage your electricians. So it costs us more. The other thing, I spoke to a girl high up, actually director level at the NHS. I said, what was the first thing you would look at? And she said, bank nursing. I said, okay. Why? She said, well, the bank nursing is a great...
just hang on a minute, Craig.
I've just worked it out. I was looking at Hilary thinking, what does
Sebastian's
that mean? Bank nursing. Sorry.
So nurses who come in to fill positions on a kind of day-to-day basis.
I'm just not used to your accent. Sorry, Craig.
I'm not a bank. An absolute great asset and facility to have, because if you've got shortages through illness or holidays or pregnancies or whatever, you can go, can we get 2 nurses in here for 3 days next week? Fantastic, right? But what happens in reality is the management of that have got so much stress and hassle and other things that the bank nurse becomes a permanent nurse, almost. So we're paying more because you have to pay them more because, they're not guaranteed to get any work in a week. And the people that are organising them, they need a bit of profit. So you end up paying almost double per hour for the bank nurse than if you just said, do you want to work here? Right? So it might take a couple of years, but go around every single department saying, right, what's the situation with bank nurses here? Now I asked her, what do you think, conservatively, you could save Scotland on bank nurses? And I couldn't believe the answer I got. The answer I got was 1 to 2 billion quid. And I was like, what? So, and there's other, crazy things. The buses, we pay £300 million per year. So our under 22s can have free bus transport, right? Sounds great. And if the way it was sold to us, if they can go to universities, libraries, sports centres, great, we'll have better kids. You're like, okay. But all it's actually done in reality is the Ned culture is now transportable and they can go anywhere in Glasgow free of charge. So instead of all the Neds being congregated in a couple of areas, the Neds.
Neds? What's Neds?
You're struggling with that?
Yeah.
Neds.
Yeah, we don't know that.
The crazy young teenagers. Ned culture. It's, the hoodies and
I've never heard of that.
Never heard of that?
No.
God. Maybe because I'm a dinosaur or Scottish or both. Anyway, the youth, delinquent youths, right?
Okay, thank you.
Instead of being confined to their own area, we give them a free bus pass. They can go to any areas now. City centres are awash with them, right? Now that costs us £300 million per year. If we said, right, it's a great idea. See if you want to go to university or you want to go to the library or you want to go to sports centres, we'll still fund your travel. I'm not saying we take it away, but it would cost us £300 million a year. And in the same month I found out that we gave the bus companies £200 million to update their fleet because we've told them they must turn green. We're now paying for that. And I'm like, hold on a minute. I, as an individual, know that I'm not going to be able to buy a petrol car after 2030. So I budget for that because I know I'm going to need to buy an electric one. So, or if I've got a business that's doing any other thing that needs transport, I need to work that into my projections. Well, we've just gave the bus companies £200 million in 1 year for that, and we've been doing it for a long time. So there's the bus companies, £500 million. And that's just me, a guy that's not a transport expert, that's just looking on the internet, reading newspapers and going, hold on a minute, can we stop? And I think that's what we can do with the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament. And that's just starters. And then we'll get, the NGOs and charities and all this stuff. Imagine how much stuff we could look at in 5 years and how much we could really save. And then we divert that into the stuff that they're all, the roads up here are terrible. We've got A9, which takes you to some beautiful parts of the country that we'd all love to visit, but the majority of it's single track. So we've been promising the people up in the Highlands that they would dual carriageway this for 20 years. We've still not done it, right? And they keep putting that up the park. We could do these things. And this is what they keep doing as well. This is why the independence thing needs shut up. We blame everybody else. If we're bad at anything, we blame either Westminster, Tories, or now Labour. And as long as we have this party, particularly the SNP, in power, wanting to create an environment that will vote for independence, they've got to tell us that Westminster's bad, everything that's English or British is bad, Brexit was great, the European Union is better, which I can't get my head around, because you want independence, but you want to get into a union with other countries. That, instead of having a union with the rest of the United Kingdom, you want a union with all these foreigners. That logic, I can't figure it out. So when you've got a party that have got to play the game of trying to get independence, then it's all they talk about. We need them hunted. We need them gone.
Okay, so
Sorry, I digress.
No, it's all very interesting. I'm just worried we're running out of time. So just to wrap up this section, are you able to sort of just give us a sense of what the unionists can do going forward over, you talked about, forgetting independence for the next 5 years and just focusing on Scotland's problems. A lot of people know that there's these devolved powers to Scotland, so there's certain things they can do and certain things that are not in their remit. What can unionists do to build a bit of consensus amongst the Scottish population?
This is a thing. This is the point, right? This is a kicker. Unionists can do nothing themselves because there's not enough of us, right? Now, what a lot of unionists do is we buy into this theory that there's 55% of the country are unionists because at the referendum there was 55% voted no. That ain't the case. I'm a unionist, right? You would really need to do a lot to convince me not to be a unionist. And there is the same on the other side of separatists. You see, the biggest group I now believe in the middle, that's the ones that make the decisions, right? You've got this load of people that don't see themselves as unionist or separatist. But we made them become one of those things by making a decision in 2014. And they could probably vote either way. And it's them that we've got to convince. And we've got to convince them that there's a better way for the country to run, regardless if it stays in a union or is independent. And that is without the SNP. And you will get through to people, and this big middle chunk supporting bit, right? The unionists are all right. We've decided what we want, right? You'll not change your mind. But there's this chunk in the middle. And I'm kind of guessing it's the biggest chunk out of three chunks. And that's the important ones. So what can a unionist do? Well, all the unionists can do is convince these people that there is a better option in SNP, regardless of their views on the union. And a phrase that I've started saying a lot is, the SNP made Scotland worse for the unionists, but they also killed the dreams of the nationalists because of their incompetence. So we actually should all hate them. But because they are the most likely vehicle to deliver independence, is the only reason that, what was 29.9% of the country at the last general election keep voting for them. So, the big chunks in the middle, and that's the ones that we need to convince. We need to convince them in 2016 that they do not vote for the nationalist parties, and that includes the Greens. And let's give us a place that's got a unionist, or we should maybe term it non-separatist majority. And then we can get the big boy pants on and the adults in the room and try and bloody sort the job out.
Sounds good to me.
Excellent. Well, if you're listening to this and you think, yes, that's what we need, then and you live in Scotland, then get in touch. Get in touch with Craig and, do something for Scotland. Okay.
You said that and it sounded Scottish.
Did I sound Scottish?
It's a long way from Scotland, yeah. It's a long way.
Mrs. Doubtfire said Scotland.
So let's move on to Culture Club. Craig, did you have something you wanted to bring to Culture Club?
Yeah, I watched it was harrowing to watch, horrific, but what an actual production was the Lockerbie box set that came out just after the New Year, I think, and just sort of watched it over 2 nights. And a story that obviously close to our hearts. I lived through it, and just you're seeing things and what a horrific story.
Just for anybody that doesn't know, just explain what the Lockerbie bombing was. And
yeah, well, 88, 89, Lockerbie, the Pan Am flight that was going from Heathrow to America, blew up and landed on Lockerbie. You couldn't have done it if you planned it that way. It's such a small dot on the map. And everybody in the plane died, and people on the ground died, and the place was just, it was like a war zone. People took a bit of time to understand what was going on, because like, you don't expect a plane to land in your garden. There was houses that were just evaporated. There was people getting found in fields miles away, body parts, and the whole thing was just bloody horrific. And they found out it was a bomb, and a guy went to jail, and the whole story was Colin Firth played an English doctor whose daughter died in the plane. He was one of the very few families affected where they weren't killed in the ground. Most of the British families were killed in the ground. American families were killed in the plane. But this was an English guy whose daughter was in the plane, and it was horrific. Very worth a watch.
Great, thank you.
Excellent.
And Sebastian, you didn't do Culture Club last week, did you? Because you wanted to keep us on our toes. And
well, I promised that I'd bring it to this week's Culture Club. So I watched a film, 2 weeks ago now, called The Death of Stalin. I don't know if either of you have seen it.
I have seen it. It's a fantastic film, yes.
Is he dead?
He is, yes.
I need to get up to speed.
So
I thought he changed his name to Starmer and went to Westminster.
Oh, very cutting, very cutting.
So in 1953, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, died, and the film depicts this scramble amongst his key supporters for who is going to succeed him, basically, and where the power is going to lie. The film starts off with this amazing scene where there's an orchestra performing this piece and a pianist, and it shows the people that are doing the tech at the back. You might see with the equipment, and they get a phone call from Stalin, and he says, "Do you have a recording of the piece? And can you send it to me?" And they hang up the phone, and the guy says, "Yeah, can you just get us the recording?" And he said, we weren't recording it. And so they have to run out and get all of the people back off. The audience have gone out into the street, and they're getting as many people as they can, and then dragging random members of the public in off the street. And they say to the pianist, "Right, do it again. Do the whole performance again, and we need to record it." The conductor faints, passes out, and they have to go and drag another conductor out of bed. And I'm watching this, and it's obviously it's a comedy. If I haven't said so, it is a comedy. It's a very dark comedy. And I'm watching this thinking, okay, they've obviously embellished certain aspects of it. I didn't realise that is true. That exact thing happened. But the only difference is that in reality, they actually went and got another conductor who was too drunk to do it. So then they had to go and get a third conductor out of bed in his pajamas. So the film director, who's Armando Iannucci of The Thick of It, a lot of British people will know him, he actually said, we can't have that detail because it's just too hard to believe. So they actually made it less or more realistic. But it is very dark. It's an amazing film because it manages to be simultaneously hilarious. I laughed more than I've really ever laughed at a film, and also very sad and depressing and dark. And I think the ability of the director to manage to balance those two things and let the audience know exactly what they should be feeling in every scene was remarkable.
Yeah. It's quite a long time since I'd seen it, so I'd forgotten that the scenes with the orchestra. But yes, certainly I know I enjoyed it. I would second your recommendation.
It really manages to depict this feeling that there would have been in the time of that constant paranoia of at any point I could be killed. When you look at the estimates of how many people died under the Soviet regime, the lower range is from 20 million. That's the lower estimate. Yeah. 20 million people. And so there was this constant fear of at any point
see that, you could be... That fear that you're talking about, I was in Moscow, was it 2018? And I was working there, and spent a bit of time going about the city. And you just get this vibe that the people there have got that, they've maybe not got that fear, but you understand the way their psyche is. It's because generations of their families had that fear, and the fear of being listened to, and the secret police, and being pulled away in the middle of the night. It's quite a weird city. I'm glad I went. I don't think I would ever get back again. But that's the sort of vibe I got about from the normal people. Just try to even talk to them in the street. It's great.
Yeah. And there's this one scene I'll just mention in particular of the funeral where Nikita Khrushchev, who's played by Steve Buscemi, is trying to get closer to Lavrenti Beria, who's on the other side of the casket. Is it casket?
Yes,
That's what it is, isn't
good
it?
word, yeah.
And it's probably the funniest scene I've ever seen in my life. I could not stop laughing. Yeah. So I would recommend anybody to go and watch it.
Steve Berlut, I can't see his name. What's that actor's name?
Steve Buscemi.
That's the guy that went back to the fire brigade during 9/11.
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely great.
Yeah.
He was a fireman before he was an actor. And then during 9/11, there was a lot of people in his old place died. He went missing. And he went and just went back, put his hat on, and was a fireman for a fortnight. Absolutely fantastic.
Good work. I do just want to mention my favourite Stalin phrase, which I do use from time to time, which is, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. That's my rationale for when sometimes you have to upset people a bit to get things done.
That was Stalin?
Yes, that was Stalin, yeah.
I've used that, and I didn't even realise where it came from.
Yes, yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that brings us to a close. Let's say thank you very much to you, Craig, for coming on and showcasing what Scotland can do politically going forward. And I certainly have a lot of hope for what you can achieve up there, and your election when you become an MSP will be in 2026, won't it? So if anybody wants...
If you were listening at the conference, I said a famous quote from Henry Ford, quite a wee bit safer guy to quote. And he said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you will probably be right. So let's just say we're there.
Absolutely. And if you want to get involved, we'll put your email address in the show notes, if that's all right, and then anybody can get in touch with you.
Great.
Excellent.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Craig.
Thanks for listening.